Alright, we're back in our study on Genesis. Open up your Bibles to Genesis chapter 1. And today we're actually going to get into verse 2. We spent a number of weeks on Genesis 1:1 trying to display some of the creative acts of God that had to have taken place before Genesis 1:2. And we went through and we diagrammed a little bit how this universe is built like a tent. Sort of like that, and how God had placed an earth there, and that was the earth, and the rest was heaven, and how He formed the sides with water that He froze, and made the whole sides ice, and all of this is within where God lives, eternity. Okay, and this is what we would call the universe where we live. And this is when time started, when God started to create space and matter. Time had a beginning back here. So we went through a lot of that and the creative process that God had to go through to get to there. And we've been talking a little bit too about, there's really two main thoughts of creation in Genesis. One is the literal sixth day, where God starts in day 1, He does something, day 2, day 3, all the way through day 6. And then there's the other thought that there's a beginning, and then there's a gap, and then God starts to recreate the earth in Genesis 1:2. And we've been showing some of the proofs for how there had to be a gap there, a period of time where God was creating way before Genesis 1:2, because by the time we get to Genesis 1:2, we're going to see, and we're going to go through the state of the universe that we find it there in Genesis 1:2 now. So we've seen how there's a lot of creative acts of God back here in the beginning, where He creates space and spreads it, and forms the earth, and lays the foundation of the earth, and we saw how the angels had to be created before the earth was, because they witnessed that earth being created. And by the time we get to Genesis 1:2, we're going to see the state of this universe now. And we know when God creates anything, He creates it good. But when we come to Genesis 1:2, we're going to find that the universe is not in a state of good. It's not perfect. It's actually going to be in a state of catastrophe. And you'd have to ask yourself, why would God, if this was how He did it, bam, 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 why would He start with making a catastrophe? It's just out of character with how God is and what He does and what He creates, because it's just not how He operates. So Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and He called the darkness night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. When we come to Genesis 1:2, we see the earth is there already. It's there. It's been created. We went through the past lesson or two when God created that, and how He did that, and when He laid the foundations of that earth. So we find it already there. And the earth, but it was without form and void. It was in a state of catastrophe, of unkeptness. It was, we're going to see in a little bit, it was actually in a state of judgment by God, without form and void. And we're going to talk about that without form and void, I believe, in the next lesson. Today I want to talk about the darkness that was there. You see, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. This area we find in Genesis 1:2 is dark. It's dark now. Now that's strange, and we'll continue. And the earth was without form and void. The earth is in a state of just a blob. It has no form to it. It's void of any life, void of any vegetation. It's just there as a blob. Darkness now covers this. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And we find that there's waters now that have engulfed the region. Here, turn one page over. That's just verse 6. We're going to talk more about these waters in an upcoming lesson, but you got to understand this to understand what the state of Genesis 1:2 is. Verse 6, and God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day. In the second day, God creates a heaven. And in order to do that, he has to make a separation of waters. Well, we know this is the heaven. And in order to recreate this, as we're going to get into here in a little bit, God had to move some waters around. So that tells me that this area was inundated with water. In order for God to have to separate the waters to create a space that he's going to call heaven there, and we're going to get there in a week or two, this area had to be filled with water. And the earth was in that water. That's why it was without form and void. Water had somehow filled that whole space God had made. And it had destroyed the earth and everything that was in there. You starting to see that? And when we come to Genesis 1:2, the state of the universe is such that this area is all dark, the earth is destroyed, and it's filled with water. Now, that doesn't sound like a promising start. That sounds like something happened to everything we've been talking about. Remember, we've been talking about how God created all this and how everything was meticulously planned and compassed out and measured out, and how God laid a foundation and put the pillars up and put the beams in, and how he froze the sides, and how the angels rejoiced when that earth was created. That's not how we find it now. So what we're going to go into a little bit here is what took place to cause the universe to be filled with water, to be dark, and to have the earth without form and void, as we find it in Genesis 1:2. And what we're going to see now in Genesis 1:2, we're going to see the days of men start. Because this is when man now is going to come onto the scene in just a little bit. But this is where God starts for us. This is where we're going to find the earth we inhabit come from. As God's now going to start to lay out how he's going to create something so that men can dwell on the earth. And this is where we're going to start. So today I want to talk about the darkness. What is this darkness? Why is there darkness? Turn over to John chapter 1. 1 John chapter 1. Let's just start here for a second. 1 John chapter 1, verse 5. It's strange that in Genesis 1:2 you have darkness. Why would there be darkness? Because in John chapter 1, verse 5, we see, this then is the message which we have heard of him, and declare unto you, that God is what? Light. And in him is what? No darkness. Okay? So if in God is no darkness, and God is light, where did this darkness come from? You see, when God was creating everything initially back here in the beginning, God's light. When he was laying the foundation of the heavens, when he was putting up those pillars, when he was issuing that water as if out of a womb to create the sides of this universe, that was all well lit. Because God is light. There was no darkness there. We talked about how eternity is bright because that's where God inhabits. And God is light. God brights up eternity. There's no darkness in eternity. And there was no darkness in God's creative acts. Because in God is no darkness. So you have to ask yourself, where did this darkness come from? Turn over to Isaiah chapter 45. See, that's an important question. If there's no darkness in God, why is there darkness in Genesis 1:2? It just makes no sense. unless if something happened that caused that darkness to arise. See, God's just not going to, according to this, type of creative pattern, you'd have darkness right there in the beginning, and that just doesn't make sense because there's no darkness in God. Something had to have happened to cause that darkness to appear. God had to do something for darkness. In Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7, I, talking about the Lord, form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. You see, since there's no darkness in God, God had to create darkness. Do you see that? Darkness had to be created. And again, there's another thing there. We've talked about a lot of creative acts that took place in Genesis 1:1, how in the beginning, and there was a lot of creation that God was doing to create all this before you even get to Genesis 1:2. Well, one of the other creative acts God had to do, he had to create this darkness. And the reason he had to create it is because there's no darkness in God. So why did he create darkness? Has to be the question. Why would God, who is light, who wants everybody to see everything, create darkness? Interesting point. In verse 7, I form the light. God never says he creates light because he is light. He never had to create light because that's what he is. He forms it though. He can take the light he is and he can display it in different ways. And we're going to see some of that later. He can form light. He can make the light that we see out there in the day. He can shine himself as light. But he can take his light and display it in different ways. But he never has to create his light. He had to create darkness. And there's a reason for that. So, why is there darkness here? My answer to that is because God had removed himself. And we're going to see this in a minute. He removed himself into what we will now call the third heaven. And when he removed himself, he created darkness to be in his place because of something evil that was taking place down here. Something evil happened, and God was going to bring judgment on this universe that he had created. And part of that judgment was his removal of himself. And see, God is light. Wherever he is, it's light. So he needed to create darkness. He needed to create what would happen if he wasn't there. And this is the first time God was going to make a place that he was not going to allow his light to shine. Because from all of eternity up till now, his light had shined everywhere. But for some reason, God's now going to withdraw himself. And behind it, he's going to create darkness to fill the void or the vacuum where he wasn't going to let his light shine anymore. Therefore, he had to create darkness. You see, God made a separation between the heaven. And we call that the third heaven now. Turn over to Job chapter 22. Job 22. See, there's darkness here because God withdrew himself. And when he withdrew himself, this is the first time God had to do this. He had to create darkness to leave behind because he wasn't going to let his light shine anymore. Job 22, we'll start with verse 12. Is not God in the height of heaven? And behold, the height of the stars, how high they are. When we look at the outside, we see the heaven and the stars, how high they are. And thou sayest, how doth God know? Can he judge through the dark cloud? You see, thick clouds are covering to him, and he seeth not. And he walketh in the circuit of heaven. Job's talking, they're talking to here. And Eliphaz is talking, and they're talking about God. And they're saying God's so high in the heavens, and he's behind the dark cloud. You see that? Can he judge through the dark cloud? See, they understood that in the heavens, there's a dark cloud that God is behind. Verse 13. How doth God know? Can he judge through the dark cloud? Thick clouds are a covering to him that he seeth not. And he walketh. What they're saying is that there's a dark cloud. That separates God from men today. And the men back in Job's time understood that. And they were saying, can God judge through and see everything on the earth through that cloud? You know, we can't see him, so therefore maybe he can't see us. See, they're talking about a separation that God made. And when God made that, he withdrew his light into this third heaven. He separated his light from the universe he had created, and therefore darkness was left behind when God withdrew himself. Turn over to Psalms 97. Psalms 97. Verse 2. He talking about the Lord. Verse 1, the Lord reigneth, let the earth rejoice, let the multitude of islands be glad thereof. Clouds and darkness are round about him. Judgment and righteousness are the habitation of his throne. His throne is surrounded by clouds and darkness. See, clouds and darkness surround that throne of God. We can't see. The reason you can't look up in the night sky and see the throne of God is because there is a dark cloud that obscures your view. You can't see it. God has made a separation now. And we're going to talk about why would God do this? Would this be part of his original creation plan? Of course not. When God originally created all this, his creation was to be with his creation, and wherever God is, there is light. So why would he cause this separation? We'll get into that in just a few minutes. But what I'm trying to point out to you is that this darkness here that we find in Genesis 1-2 is there for a reason, and the reason is because God has withdrawn himself out of this section into the top part of creation, and he made a cloud that covers it. Turn over to Job chapter 37. Job 37, verse 19. Job 37:19. Talking about the Lord. Teach us what we shall say unto him, for we cannot order our speech by reason of darkness. Shall it be told him that I speak? If a man speaks, surely he shall be swallowed up. And now men see not the bright light which is in the clouds, but the wind passeth and cleanseth them. Man cannot see the bright light which is where? In the clouds. See, up here, there's a bright light. And we can't see it because of this cloud, this covering God has made. And this covering prevents this bright light from coming through, and therefore God creates darkness down here. And that's the state of the universe that we find in Genesis 1-2, is that it's dark. But we know God's still there and God still exists. He's just removed himself to the top third of the heaven. It's called the third heaven. Turn over to Revelation chapter 4. Revelation chapter 4. In the book of Revelation, we have John, who is allowed to see visions and is actually taken forward in time to see what's taking place in the future. And he's experiencing it in real time. And he's taken up to the third heaven, and he's set upon, in Revelation chapter 4, verse 6. And before the throne, he sees this throne of God, which is brightly lit. There was a sea of glass, like unto crystal. And in the midst of the throne, around about the throne, were four beasts full of eyes before and behind him. But he sees in verse 6, in the very beginning, a sea of glass like unto crystal. As he gets, John is taken up here. That's going to be our John. And he sees the throne of God, and it's on a sea of crystal. It's on crystal is frozen water. And it's like a sea of glass. So on the top part of this cloud, God has frozen it solid. So he sees it from this side, it's like crystal. What does crystal do? Crystal reflects back the light. God's brightness here is being reflected back up into the third heaven by this sea of glass that John sees. But we can't see it because it's reflecting the light back, and all we see is darkness because on this side, it's dark. Do you see that? Turn over to Revelation chapter 15, verse 2. Revelations 15, verse 2. And John here, and I saw, as it were, a sea of glass mingled with fire. And then they had gotten the victory of the beast, and over his image, over his mark, and the number of his name, stand on the sea of glass, having the harps of God. John again says he's standing on that sea of glass. He's up there in the third heaven. We can't see it because it's obscured. But the top part of that cloud is solid, crystal. Solid like glass. Just reflecting the light back up. Yeah, it's like, you take water and you shine light on water. If you're out on a boat or you're looking at a lake and the sun's hitting it right, the rays are just bouncing right back. Blinds you at times. That's what heaven's like, the third heaven. And underneath that glass is a dark cloud. It's dark. We can't see in anymore. You have to understand this. This is the state of the universe you're finding in Genesis 1:2. And another thing that, side note, turn to Revelation chapter 4. Something about this third heaven. John, he's on the earth. And God's going to be calling for him to come up. And I looked, and behold, a door was opened in heaven. And the first voice which I heard was as a trumpet talking to me, said, "Come up hither, and I will show thee things which must be hereafter." John, he's standing on the earth, and he looks up, and what happens up there? A door opens. You know what? In this third heaven, there's a door that God has created that can be opened and closed that allows entry into that third heaven. Turn over to Revelation chapter 19, verse 11. Revelations 19:11. This door opens and closes. This door opened and allowed John to come in. Verse 11. And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse. And he that sat on him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he doth judge and make war. This door, John sees this door open again, and you know who comes out of it? Jesus Christ, ready to go to war against the earth. He sees heaven open. That door opens and closes. It allows people and angels and God himself to go through. That's how that's designed. And that's where John went up. I mean, we'll talk about, when Paul saw the glory of God in Acts, chapter 9 there, on the road to Damascus, you know what he saw? He saw Jesus Christ, and the reason he was able to, because that door opened and the brightness of God was able to just shine right through and hit him. That's what he was seeing. The glory of Jesus Christ, that door was open, and bam! blinded everybody around, blinded Paul, and everybody else got stunned by it. That's how bright it was. Brighter than the sun. That's how bright it is up there. Because God is there. Wherever God is, it's light. Go to Revelations chapter 21. Revelations 21, verse 23. Now we know there's a city up there, New Jerusalem. It's going to be coming down. This is talking about something in the future, but notice about the Lord. Verse 23. And the city that had no need of the sun, neither of the moon to shine in it. For the glory of God did lighten it, and the Lamb is the light thereof. You see, when God creates this New Jerusalem and He brings it down, there's no need for a sun or a moon. You know why? Because God's there, and God brightens the whole area up. This area in the third heaven is bright because that's where God is, living there. And He has withdrawn Himself behind the dark cloud and lives in the third heaven. So when we come back to Genesis, let's go to Genesis 1 again. And we see the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. That darkness is there because God has withdrawn Himself. And He created that darkness in His absence. Because God now, by the time you get to Genesis 1-2, is in the third heaven. Do you understand that? Mm-hmm. So this is telling me there had to be a gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 for all this to take place. Because we're going to see this darkness isn't just dark like this. Darkness comes in a couple different forms we're going to talk about in a second here. But you have to understand, this is the state of the universe you find in Genesis 1:2. God's up here. He sealed Himself off from down here. He created darkness and He flooded this area with water. And the earth now is in a state of confusion. Okay? Now that doesn't sound like a promising start, does it? That doesn't sound like something God would just initially create in Genesis 1:1. A big mess. No. There's a reason the earth and the universe is found in this state. And it's because of this darkness that now, this darkness is dwelling underneath God on the face of the deep. So, what is this darkness? Well, darkness is an absence of light. Where darkness is, there's no light. It's the opposite. It's not just the absence of light. Darkness is also the opposite of light. Okay? That's what it is. As we've seen, God's not there. He's withdrawn His light. Let's notice now. Let's talk about darkness and what it is. What is that darkness? Because this is important. What is that darkness in Genesis 1:2? Now, darkness comes, we're going to see, it comes in a couple different forms. I'll just put them up here. We're going to see there's a physical darkness. We're going to see there's a spiritual darkness. And there's also a darkness of judgment. Those are the three forms of darkness. How darkness can exist in. Okay? This darkness here, let's see what this darkness here in Genesis 1:2 is. Well, it is physical darkness. Because as we see here, go turn over to Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. There is physical darkness down here. Literally darkness that you can't see because the physical light has been withdrawn. And the way we know that is in Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. God said, "Let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and for years. Let them be for lights in the firmament of heaven, to give light upon the earth." And it was so. If God has to make light in Genesis chapter 1, verse 14, 15 there, that means there was physical darkness there, right? If he has to make a sun and a moon to give light upon the earth, that means before the sun and the moon were made, there was physical darkness there. You see that? Verse 15 and 16, and God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and he made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth. Until you get to Genesis chapter 1, verse 14 through 18 here, there is dark. It's dark. Physical darkness is here. You can't see. And God has to make these lights to shine out here. Verse 17, and God set them in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. To divide the light from the darkness, that's physical light and physical darkness. Do you see that? So yes, in Genesis 1:2, there is physical darkness that you see there. But God does not deal with it until Genesis verse 14 through 18, right? A little bit later, on day number 4. So on day 4, God deals with the physical darkness. So yes, there is physical darkness that God deals with on day 4 when he makes the stars and the sun and the moon. Okay? But that's important because now come back to Genesis 1:2. But notice the Genesis 1:2, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Well, that darkness there we know is physical. But God takes care of the physical darkness when? On day 4. But here we're going to see God does something with this darkness. Verse 3, and God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. Well, didn't he divide the light from the darkness on day 4? And here he's doing it on day 1. Do you see that? This is important. But on day 4, he's dealing with physical darkness. What do you think he's dealing with on day 1? Spiritual darkness. You see that? And God divided the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and he called the darkness night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. The darkness God deals with in Genesis 1:2 is not physical darkness. Because he deals with that on day 4. So what darkness is he dealing with on day 1? It has to be spiritual darkness. This is very important to understand, because when we get to the light and what God says there, that light's not the sun and the stars. That light's going to be in the spiritual realm. God's going to be doing something there spiritually first, before he deals with the physical. So if the physical darkness is dwelt in Genesis 1, 14 through 18, the darkness of Genesis 1:2 must be spiritual. And you notice how he says there in verse 5, and God called the light day and the darkness he called night. That's a different night and day than what we see in verse 18. Drop down to 1:18. To rule over the day and over the night, to divide the light from the darkness. That's physical darkness there in 1:18. What you're dealing with in verse 5 is spiritual darkness. You see how he's dividing light and day, night and day in verse 5? That's spiritual, because in the physical realm he's doing it in verse 18. So now we've seen this darkness here is physical, but it's also spiritual. There's a spiritual darkness in Genesis 1:2 that has engulfed everything beneath the third heaven. You see, when Paul saw light in Acts chapter 9, that was physical light that he saw. He was blinded by it. It was bright. It was brighter than the sun. That was physical light. But this darkness here and the light that God's going to bring on in verse 3, 4, and 5 here is going to be spiritual light. So you turn over to John chapter 1. John chapter 1. I'll get there. Verse 8. Verse 7. The same was a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. There's a light that lights every man that comes into the world. That's not physical light. Because there are people who are born who never see physical light because they're blind. But God's dealing here with a spiritual light. And we're going to make this connection back in Genesis chapter 1, 3, 4, and 5 there in the next week or two here. But what I'm trying to say is there's a spiritual light to combat this spiritual darkness. And we're going to get into that light in just a little bit. But the darkness of Genesis 1, 2 is spiritual. And we're going to see in a little bit if we have time. It's also a judgment of God. Well, let's talk about this. Since we're in John, turn over to chapter 9. How darkness can be spiritual. Verse 4. When Jesus is talking, I must work the works of him that sent me, while it is day. The night cometh, when no man can work. When the Lord there talks about the day and the night, he's not talking about physical 24-hour rotations of the sun and the moon. He's talking about a spiritual day and a spiritual night, a night that's coming. Remember, we're going to get into this, the difference between day and night, back that God makes in Genesis 1:5. Well, here it is again, it pops up here. There's a difference between the day and the night, spiritually. Turn over to 1 Thessalonians. Go to 1 Thessalonians. Chapter 5. Verse 5. Ye are all children of light, and children of the day. We are not of the night, nor of darkness. He's talking about spiritual issues here. If you're saved and you're in the age of grace, you're in the day. You're not in the night. You see that? That's a spiritual night there. You're not in darkness. You're in the day. Turn over to 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. What I'm trying to just prove here is that this darkness is spiritual and that there is spiritual darkness out there. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. But ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praise of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. That darkness there is spiritual. It's not this. It's a spiritual darkness. God has called Israel there out of darkness and into his light. You see, this darkness is spiritual. Go back to Isaiah chapter 60. You're going to see this darkness can spread. Isaiah chapter 60, verse 2. There's a darkness out there. Verse 1, arise, shine, for the light is come, and the glory of the Lord is risen upon thee. There the light is equated with the glory of the Lord, and we know that glory is up here right now in the third heaven. But, for behold, the darkness shall cover the earth, and gross darkness the people. But the Lord shall rise upon thee, and his glory shall be seen upon thee. There's a darkness that shall cover the earth. The earth once again will sit in complete, gross darkness. That's spiritual darkness. And this is going to take place right before the day of the Lord, and we're not going to get into that now. What I want you to see here, though, is there's a spiritual darkness that grows, that wants to cover the earth again, just like it did in Genesis 1:2. In Genesis 1:2, the earth is covered in darkness. There's a darkness now that grows, that shall cover the earth again, just as God did in just as it happened in Genesis 1:2. So this darkness is spiritual in nature. This darkness has works. Go back to Romans chapter 13, verse 12. The night is far spent. The day is at hand. These are spiritual applications. He's not talking that it's because it's 3 in the morning, it's dark. No. The night is far spent. The day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness. Let us put on the armor of light. Darkness has works. You see that? There are things that darkness does. It wants to cover the earth, and it does things. Turn over to Luke chapter 22. Luke 22, verse 53. I was daily with you in the temple. Ye stretched forth no hand against me. But this is your hour, the power of darkness. Darkness has power. See, this isn't just some weak little spiritual thing out there. This darkness does works. It has power to do things. It wants to do things. Go to Proverbs chapter 2. Proverbs chapter 2, verse 13. Verse 12. To deliver thee from the way of the evil man, from the man that speaketh forward things, who leave the path of unrighteousness, to walk in the ways of what? Darkness. Darkness has ways that it wants you to walk in. You see that? Darkness has paths that it wants people to follow. Since we're in Proverbs chapter 4, verse 19. The way of the wicked is as darkness, that know not at what they stumble. Darkness is wicked. It's evil. It's against God. Remember we said darkness is the opposite of light? It's opposite of what God is. Turn over to John chapter 1. John chapter 1. See, this darkness that you find in Genesis 1:2 is not just because it's dark out and you can't see. There's an entity there. John chapter 1, verse 5. The light shineth in darkness, and the darkness comprehendeth it not. Darkness can comprehend. I think I spelled that right. Yeah, comprehend it. Yeah, there's an E. Yeah, I got it. You know what that means? Darkness thinks. It's alive. For something to comprehend, it has to have thought. It's a being. It's an entity. There is an entity, guys, that thinks, that can comprehend, that can have thoughts, that is putting together a plan that has power, that does works, and has developed ways to bring things into darkness. This darkness of Genesis 1:2 is this. This is what spiritual darkness is. This is really, boy, I can't stress how important this is to understand that the Genesis of 1-2 can think, is wicked, has works and ways, and has power. It's not just physical blindness, because that gets taken later in Genesis 1, verse 14 through 18, like we saw in day 4. The darkness in Genesis 1-2 is spiritual darkness. And God's going to deal with that, and we're going to get to that in another week or two. Go to Ephesians. Ephesians chapter 4, about this darkness. Hopefully that. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 18. Having the understanding darkened. You talk about Gentiles who are unsaved. When your understanding is darkened, in verse 18, you are being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them because of the blindness of their heart. Darkness brings alienation from God. It brings separation. You see that? You know why God separated himself from the darkness? He separated it because of the darkness that was down there. He separated himself from it. Having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God. God withdrew his life. He withdrew himself up to the third heaven. He put a cloud there, and he said, if you want to be dark, you're going to be dark on your own without me. Enjoy it. And he creates physical darkness, and he just leaves them in the dark. In Genesis 1-2. Okay, there's a separation between God and darkness, between light and darkness. They cannot mix. You cannot take the one and put it in the other and mix the two. They don't go together. Turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14. And we'll see here, 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14. Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? Light and darkness cannot mix. They cannot be together. You see there? What a fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? Darkness is unrighteous. God is righteous. There's no in between. And he's telling us here, when you're looking for a partner in life to marry, don't marry someone who's not saved, because you will never get along. It does not work. You'll end up hating it, or the believer will let go of their Christian life and follow the path of darkness. But that's a whole other topic. But what I'm trying to say here, what God's trying to say, is there is no communion between light and darkness. They cannot coexist. Turn over to Ephesians chapter 5. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 8. For ye were sometimes darkness, but now ye are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. When we were unsaved, we were in this darkness. But when you're saved, you're in the light. Verse 11. And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. These works of darkness, God says, are unfruitful. They do not produce love, joy, peace. They cannot do that. God says, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works. These works are unfruitful. They do not bring life. We see that back in the garden. The tree of life, that was to give life. But Adam and Eve chose darkness. And their life ended spiritually at that time. And then physically a little bit later in time. Darkness brings death. Darkness brings death. You play with darkness in your life, you're going to have problems. It's just how it is. But back in Genesis 1:2, this darkness that we see there is not just physical darkness, it's a spiritual darkness. It's all of this wrapped up. All of that is working in Genesis 1:2 already. It has to be. What is this darkness in reality? Acts 26. Acts chapter 26, verse 18. I'll wrap it up here in just a few minutes, but this is important. Acts 26. To open their eyes and to turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan unto God. We see darkness. We got darkness. And we see light. The darkness is associated with, let me get it again, 18, lost my place. The power of who? Satan. And the light is associated with the power of God. You know who's behind this darkness? You know who's behind the power of darkness that you see in Genesis 1:2? Satan. He's already existed. He's already fallen. He's already instituted a policy of evil. He's already started some working. He has power. He's become unrighteous. He thinks. He comprehends. That's Satan. The fall of Satan had to happen before Genesis 1:2. That's why there's darkness when you get there in Genesis 1:2. That's why there's spiritual darkness. That spiritual darkness started the day Lucifer sinned. And it spread throughout that universe. And God makes a judgment against the satanic rebellion. He withdraws himself up here. He puts a curtain out. He seals himself off. And he says, if you want to be satanic, fine. You're down there and I'm going to be up here. And he floods the universe with water. And leaves it in that state. And that's the state you find the universe in Genesis 1:2 in. There is no other way you get to Genesis 1:2 other than the way we just described. It has to be that way. The darkness there is the power of Satan. That proves that Satan, Lucifer, was created before Genesis 1:2, and it proves that he fell before Genesis 1:2. Because that darkness there is satanic, and it's evil, and it's the opposite of God. It's unrighteousness on display. Turn over to Ephesians chapter 6. It wasn't only Satan who fell. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness where in high places. There are rulers of darkness. You know what? To have rulers, you need to have more than one. There are principalities, powers, rulers of this darkness. When Satan fell, he corrupted a number of the angelic creation with him, and they joined him in his path of darkness. And they walked the way of darkness. And they rule over the earth, continuing till today. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities. These are spiritual. These are not flesh and blood. We're not talking about the light that we see from the sun. We're talking about spiritual issues here. Against powers, against rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Spiritual wickedness is what you find in Genesis 1:2. That darkness is wicked. And Satan, when Lucifer sinned and fell, he brought a number of the angelic creation with him. And they joined in his rebellion against God back before Genesis 1:2. And when that rebellion took place, God said, fine, I'm going to separate myself from it. because light has no communion with darkness. And he goes up into the third heaven and removes himself. And he leaves Satan and the principalities and powers and rulers down here. And he says, and then he floods it with water. And we're gonna stop here. Well, Colossians chapter 1. Colossians chapter 1. Who hath delivered us from the power of darkness. Talking about you and I. This darkness still exists. It has power. And hath translated us into the kingdom of his dear Son. God has a kingdom. They are different. It is different than the power of darkness. Well, that's a lot to get in this lesson, but I hope you understood. Understood, stand, put them together, you stood. that darkness in Genesis 1:2 is Satan, is evil, and that he had corrupted what God initially created. Now, we're not going to go through the fall of Satan. Maybe we'll do that next week or in another lesson. But what you need to understand now is we're going to go forward. We're going to look at the earth with being without form and void. And there's a darkness of judgment too. We're going to look at that too. We'll do that in the next lesson. But understand, Satan exists. He is evil. He corrupts. And he is unrighteous. But the thing you need, he comprehends. He thinks. He's alive. He's an entity. He makes plans against God to propel himself upward. We'll talk maybe more about that in the next lesson or two. But what you need to understand, Genesis 1:2, that darkness is physical, yes. There is physical darkness there. But more importantly, there's a spiritual darkness. And next lesson we'll talk about, just a few minutes, about there's a judgment of darkness that God brings upon them. But then we're going to see what that light is in Genesis 1:3 and why it's so important. And we'll get to that in the next lesson. So, all right. Thanks.